a triple threat of a disaster, a full moon, a high tide, and an approaching hurricane. The result, Superstorm Sandy, a multi-billion-dollar epic tragedy that destroyed homes and businesses, turned lives upside down, and in some cases, ended lives. Take a look.
67-year-old Elmer Lamberson is a retiree and will never forget the night Superstorm Sandy demolished his home.
Basically, I stood in the water up to my waist in my house for 3.5 hours, holding the front door closed so the water wouldn't come in.
He moved into this house 40 years ago, right after serving in the Vietnam War, and raised a family of 5 on a $35,000 salary. Over the past year, he and 220 families have been living in temporary housing apartments. Lamberson says after the storm, help didn't come fast enough.
And nobody's given nobody no money yet. Even my neighbor building across the street, he's got to use his retirement fund to build with.
However, across New Jersey, service organizations are working to help families affected by the storm. Nancy Duran, president of Habitat for Humanity, says they raised more than $500,000 and private funds to repair homes.
We have 18 projects going on right now in Union Beach. This is a new home we're building for Elmer, who is so well deserving.
Exactly after 2 years since the storm hit, some people are still struggling to rebuild their lives. But it's a compassion of those helping that has given many of these communities the strength to pick up the pieces and carry on.
We're back live on set here at Fresh Outlook now. I am joined by the Ebru think tank, Janice Selinger, the acting director of the New Jersey Work Environment Council, Captain Joe Geleta of the New Jersey Office of Emergency Management, and Yohuru Williams of Fairfield University. And Janice, I'm going to begin with you and ask you, billions and billions of dollars, $60 billion from the federal government alone was approved for Superstorm Sandy relief. Why aren't these people better by now? Why isn't New Jersey and New York and Connecticut fully rebuilt by now?
Well, I can't really address totally why that happened, but what we were doing, from the New Jersey Work Environment Council is trying to get the word out about rebuilding safely, because it's taking a long time. Sometimes people would tackle something like mold. When you have water after a storm like Hurricane Sandy, people think they can get rid of the mold quickly. And it's good to address it quickly because you want to get to the water right away, so you don't have a problem. But what would happen, and what we found, was people thought they resolved the problem, but they didn't get at all the mold. Maybe it was behind the walls, maybe they didn't address it. So people are still dealing with those kinds of cleanup issues.
Were they strangled by bureaucratic red tape?
Well, again, that really isn't my area.
I'm not blaming
to
you,
talk.
I'm just seeking your thoughts.
That's not really my area to talk about.
I'm not saying it's your fault.
I think it's a huge area.
Right.
And I think what we were finding is that obviously they needed to get approval before they could do some of the work. Right. And so some of it, took time, to be able to get done. And, again, it is just a huge problem and a lot of people impacted.
Captain Joe Geleta, you were on the front lines during Superstorm Sandy. Tell me about what happened 2 years ago and what's happening now 2 years later. Are you shocked that it's taken this long for recovery fully to have happened, or when you saw the magnitude of the losses, you realized this might take years?
Well, clearly every time there's a presidentially declared disaster, we in the State Office of Emergency Management have to work in partnership with FEMA and of course our county offices of emergency management to ensure that the money that goes out, the taxpayer money, is expended in an efficient manner based on the rules set forth by us by the Robert T. Stafford Act and Chapter 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It's very critical that it's not like a blank check that goes out, but we as the State Office of Emergency Management work in partnership with our counties to ensure all those communities that are trying to rebuild have the tools needed. And since we had about $1.8 billion allocated from FEMA to the state, we probably expended over $800 million to help communities recover.
And what's that $800 million used for?
Well, there's two different programs that we work with FEMA. There's the Public Assistance Program, which allows people to do emergency work with debris removal and emergency protective measures. And then there's that more permanent work to rebuild facilities or municipal complexes that were damaged. And we also work with hazard mitigation to build a more resilient New Jersey, to look at where we fell short in the past and how can we rebuild structures to make them more resilient for future storms. And that's critical, what we've been doing thus far. But we can't forget the countless survivors that are still crying out for help. And we in the State Office of Emergency Management partner with people like Janice and the Work Environment Council, our New Jersey voluntary organizations active in disasters, and partnering with them, we help those 250,000 plus survivors that requested FEMA federal aid to help them with those unmet needs that still continue. They still may need some type of appliances that are still not working, or like Janice mentioned, the mold remediation. We have countless organizations that are still to this day helping out, and the 14 long-term recovery groups that have been established throughout the state, they're the ones that help those survivors that still need that individual attention that maybe FEMA couldn't help them out with.
Yohuru, what's your take on this? We hear that people in the New Orleans area are still suffering from Katrina years later. Is this what you expected? I feel like such a colossal amount of money was thrown at Superstorm Sandy. Like I said, $60 billion from the federal government alone, that everybody who needs a new house could have a new house by now. That's what I would think as a layperson.
But part of the problem is that people want to return to those communities, and it is part of what Janice talked about in terms of, and Paul as well, rebuilding stronger, being in a position to think about what new materials you want to put in place, being concerned about the long-term health impacts of things like mold remediation. People don't consider, but what are long-term prospects for birth defects that might grow out of something like this if you move too quickly, if you don't consider environmental impact. And these are the things at the time that most folks aren't really concerned with. We had a great response here in New Jersey, I think, of faith-based organizations in addition to our government agencies, and they did some tremendous work, but again, moving sometimes too quickly and not being worried about code, just being worried about meeting the immediate needs, and those long-term impacts have to really be taken into account.
Janice, one phrase that came out of this was stronger than the storm. We certainly weren't for Hurricane Sandy. Are we prepared today in 2015 for another Sandy if it were to strike?
I think one of the things that's happening in New Jersey, and I think Captain Geleta can probably address this a little bit better, but there is an organization that Kathy McCann is working with, that's with our volunteers in New Jersey, and they're trying to look at what to do for the future so that you're better planned, but more prepared for what's going to be happening in the future with with another storm. And I think with what we did from the New Jersey Work Environment Council, our focus was really to make sure that there isn't a second disaster. And it's kind of picking up on what you were saying. That
when you say a second disaster, not a second natural disaster, but a second wave of disaster spawned from the first?
Absolutely. That the idea that if you're trying to help and you're trying to rebuild, you don't want to get yourself sick doing so. And that really was our focus. We were offering free training so that people would be able to identify hazards and realize that if you're doing that rebuilding, you don't want to expose yourself to asbestos, you don't want to expose yourself to other things that can harm you and make you sicker. You don't want to be up on a ladder doing reconstruction and not use the proper ladder or not use the ladder properly. There's a lot of, they say that the ladders shimmy because they stick the ladder in the sand, down at the shore and it's moving. And, how can you be safe if you're doing that or not using the scaffolding properly or not even using generators properly, when it's cold and you lose your electricity. There are a lot of people during storms, not even just, a hurricane. If we had these horrible winter storms that we had this year, you want to make sure that you use those generators properly and don't, again, get exposed to carbon monoxide, you die.
Exactly. Joe, I'll put you on the spot because that's my job. Did anybody drop the ball?
I would say there's always things we could learn from the disaster recovery efforts.
And what could we learn from this one?
Well, the collaboration is the key with any disaster, and I think outreach before a disaster is critical. As you mentioned, and that was perfect about the planning efforts. It's very critical that we plan. I mean, we in the state make sure we have state plans, the counties have plans, the town have plans. We like to stress that, what about the nucleus of the family? Shouldn't they be prepared for the worst disaster that could come? So we have initiatives like Citizen Corps to get people trained in disaster preparedness so they, as a family unit, can survive and not rely on government all the time. That's the key. Have your water, have your food, have those critical medical supplies you need, and then eventually help out with your community to recover. That's the key. So again, we always, after action, report our response, and we try to improve upon it. That's very critical.
Final thought, 10 seconds, sir.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, and that's the long-term takeaway for all of us, is that preparation is key. And thinking about this not in terms of what the federal government can always do, because FEMA really needs to be reformed. It responds to far too many disasters, but re-empowering the states to address a lot of things that Captain Geleta talked about.
Captain Geleta, thank you very much. Janice, thank you for joining us as well. When we come back, we're going to be talking about another disaster, a man-made disaster. Ferguson, Missouri, a look at its impact and beyond after this.